lasting impact. And today I have my special guest. She's untold decision support for founders and entrepreneurs, no other than Miss Jodi Hume. Welcome, Miss Jodi on Entrepreneurship 101. And can you please introduce more about yourself that I missed?
Sure. So we're going to talk a bunch about my early career, which was with an architecture firm as we grew from about 1 million a year up to about 15 million a year. I was there for 16 years. And then that rolled really nicely into the coaching and facilitation business that I now do full time since 2010.
Yes, and thank you so much for sharing your knowledge and wisdom to the world, Miss Jodi. Thank you. So today let's talk about being 15-year career as a COO of a growing architecture firm. Your entry into the architecture world was completely accidental. You were working at the National Institute of Health doing psychological research when the government shut down in 1995, and you took a temporary job answering phones in an architecture firm expecting to stay 6 months. You stayed for 16 years and become COO. When you look back, what kept you there? What did you discover in the world that you were not expecting?
Yeah, so I am a very right brain and left brain person. So I need a certain amount of like creativity, but I also like creating structure and organizing things and making them better. And architecture, aside from the work that I was doing, architecture is very much, there's certainly a very creative side. And there's a lot of innovation and problem solving within what you do in architecture. But it is not just designing pretty buildings. They have to stay up, they have to not leak. So there's a lot of rigor to it as well. And then paired with that was the work that I got to be doing. They shortly after I started there, they gave me, I got to take over marketing, and that put me in the weekly leadership team meetings, which every single Monday we met for 2 to 3 hours to discuss everything going on in the firm, every decision we had. And that was probably better than any MBA I could have possibly had, because we grappled with every single thing we were trying to figure out as we were growing pretty quickly. And I facilitated those meetings from pretty early on, and that's how I got an interest in facilitation. And it was just a wonderful experience getting to grow a company with people. The architects just wanted to be architects, so they were happy to let me just take over, piece by piece by piece. Eventually I just became the COO. And it was also an incredibly well-run company. They did leadership and culture extremely well, and I learned a lot about how to do things right. So it was, I just loved being a part of it, and there was always something new for me to tackle until much later in my time there, and that was perfect for me. I'm really good at making things better. I lose interest once they're better and you have to just maintain them, but that's where my skill set came in. It's not unlike what I end up doing with companies now, but I just got to do that inside one company for quite a while.
Very well said. Miss Jodi, you said those 16 years watching the firm grow from 8 people to 10 million in revenue. We are a better education than I could have ever gone to a school for. What
Yeah.
made that experience so formative? Was there a specific moment when you realized you were learning something that no classroom could teach?
Well, I mean, I think in classes and in training, you can get a lot of great information. And that's across the board. You can learn things, you can learn information, but the application of that information is where the rubber really meets the road. And that's why I feel the way I do about even coaching, but like training in general. It's great to learn the theory, but until you actually try and go out there and do the thing, and then have to navigate what happens when the way somebody said was the right way to do it didn't work, or there's other complexities or multiple competing priorities. Every single week we were grappling with new decisions or fixing decisions that we had made previously. So either the environment was changing, or we just realized that, hey, that wasn't the best idea. And it was such a wonderful experience working with people who were always in that mindset of how can we be better? What are we learning from this? And so there weren't as much specific moments as much as just my awareness. I would talk to other people who were in very specific jobs, and you can learn a lot deep in any given area. And I was really getting to see every aspect, from the operations to the finances to the marketing to HR to IT support, to when we moved offices and all the things we had to think about to keep things the way they are. And then also the people side of things, the culture, and how we valued employees and how we incorporated them, and then how they taught us to be leaders. Very early on, they would bring the associates and the senior associates to the yearly leadership retreats, and they would involve us in the big decisions. And I think there are a lot of parallels to the way I parent, in that you can't expect people to learn things that they don't have a line of sight to. And they did a really good job of giving us line of sight and involving us in like how to think. I encounter a lot of entrepreneurs now that get frustrated that their people don't think the way that they want them to. They don't make decisions the way they want them to. They don't consider secondary consequences and whatnot. But what I will also often point them to is, well, have you involved them in these decisions? Have you shown them how you think things through and what the process is? Because if they don't have line of sight to how you consider 20 different things at once and competing priorities, and how uh, you navigate when you don't have a great option. You have four mediocre options that are just bad in different ways, and how do you handle that? And then probably most importantly, how do you with grace fix things that you didn't make the best decision? Maybe you made the best decision based on the information you had at the time, but that is often in entrepreneurship very limited information. You have to make a lot of guesses, and that takes some courage and confidence to know that if you don't get it right, we can fix it, and to know when you need to get it right. And that's just a nuance that I don't think you can teach in a class. You can only learn it in applied action.
Certainly. So tell us at the core what it's all about. Entrepreneurs navigating growth and acquisition.
Yeah. So when I started this work, I was still at the architecture firm. I was starting off doing mostly facilitation with a little bit of coaching, leadership coaching, executive coaching, a little bit of life coaching, and I did that for a number of years. But I probably around like 2013, I started to notice that a lot of people reach out for coaching when I don't actually believe they need a coach. They need it. They need more like a facilitated conversation of their own thinking, because at some level they know. I will always point an entrepreneur back to their own knowing, and that's actually part of the most important process of how I work with my clients, is that discerning and sorting. What do I actually know? Sometimes there's information they don't have. Sometimes they need guidance or suggestions or direction. But a lot of times it's just listening to how they talk about a thing, and noticing where they actually have some kind of knowing about whether something's a good idea or a bad idea. Or sometimes whether what's actually going on is that they're exhausted and they need a break, maybe not even a sleep. They need some kind of, I use a lot of neuroscience in my work, and your brain needs certain things. And if you run it into the ground, it is not going to be your best ally in being in entrepreneurship. So that self-management, both emotionally and energetically, is also a really big part of it. So what I shifted to was less the sort of typical coaching model where you're talking to someone every second Tuesday at 3 or something. And instead turned it more into an on-call service, because in entrepreneurship, problems don't happen every other Tuesday. They happen when they happen. And I wanted to be able to partner in that conversation when the thing was actually happening. And so that is why I call it on-call decision support. And it's also a little bit of business therapy, but entrepreneurs have so many decisions, and a great many of them they can make on their own. But when you're stuck, when you're spinning your wheels, when just something isn't clicking, that is the one kind of quicksand that you have to have ways to avoid. So I have groups. Some people prefer group setting, other people prefer the one-on-one. And then I'll also do it with teams to help them talk things through, make decisions, get clear on things. And I think of it as kind of, almost with the old printers, the inkjet printers, like, paper starts to come out with little lines and dots, and you need to
Big
clean the print
materials.
head. And it's
Mhm.
kind of like that. Like, sometimes it's just like cleaning the print
Mm.
heads so that someone can get their clarity back. Or sometimes there's no clarity to be found, and it's just a situation where you need some confidence or maybe even just courage, because you're not going to be able to know what the right decision is. So you just have to get as clear as you can, make a decision, and then be ready to adapt that decision, because sometimes that's as good as it gets when you're running a company, especially if you're doing something a little bit off the beaten path. Running a franchise is different than trying to create a thing that hasn't existed the way you're doing it. So there's tons of uncertainty.
Well, good luck to that business, Miss Jodi. And speaking of decision, you sat in weekly leadership meetings for years, watching every major decision get made, revisited, and course corrected in real time. What did repeated exposure to the messiness of real decision making teach you about how leaders actually operate versus how they think they operate?
Oh, that's a great question. I often So a couple things. This one's a really very, very simple one, but it was one of the first things I cognitively noticed while facilitating those meetings. And it happens all the time. It actually just happened, actually in a gym class I was in, where two people are actually talking about completely different things. The first example of this, I noticed one of the principals of the architecture firm was talking about a project. Another one was actually talking about an employee, and they had a conversation where they thought they made a decision and they weren't even talking about the same thing. It's like a upgraded version of people misunderstanding each other. But often in communication, like, that is where sometimes there's a disconnect where both people would have walked out of that moment thinking that they had made a decision. And then when they went off and acted on that decision, they would have both been maybe not mad at, but they were like, "What? Why did you do that? We talked about that." No, we didn't. So there's this, one of the key things I've noticed is do the due diligence to make sure that you are actually even talking about the same thing, not just that you agree or have like a minor misunderstanding, but sometimes there are chasms in what people are actually talking about. So that was one of the first realizations. The other one is, I think sometimes leaders are surprised by small things that they do that miscommunicate what they're actually trying to say. I worked with one client who, again, these are funny quirks, so they don't apply to everyone, but we all have like weird things like this. Um, when you were telling him something, his thinking face would be he'd like shake his head while you were talking. And it gave off the impression that he disagreed. He was like, no, no, I don't like that idea. And people would just kind of shut down because they thought he was saying, I don't like that. And in fact, that's not at all what he was saying. It was just a weird habit, just a little quirk in his behavior. And so those awarenesses, because when you are leading, there's a power dynamic and people are watching you with such a close eye. I think of those shows or movies where somebody's at like an auction and they scratch their nose and accidentally bid on a thing. Um, that's kind of what it's like being a leader. That doesn't mean you need to walk on eggshells, but you have to be aware that your emotions, like if you're frustrated, people are going to notice it. If you're frustrated at a 6, people are going to notice it at a 12. And or if you are, whatever your emotions is, they are going to flavor the soup of what is going on. And so regulating your own emotions so that you can be clear and not inadvertently, um, uh, misdirect people in what your expectations are is really important. Another really big gap I see is I work with a lot of people. Most of my clients are really fast thinkers. They're visionary thinkers. They see further and wider and in like multiple dimensions sometimes than the people on their team who might be more uh, uh, like specifically focused in a certain area. And there can be a frustration gap there if you are a really fast thinker because you think you can just kind of suggest like a big idea and that people will be able to map all the things you thought through. And again, back to that thing I was saying about giving people line of sight, training them how to think. It feels frustrating in the moment to have to slow down, but if you invest some time and energy into slowing down and make sure people see the path of how you got to that decision, and more importantly, at places along there, be asking questions so that they can actually go through some of the thinking. You don't have to do a lot of that for them to start to see why you're thinking about it differently than they're seeing it. Because there is a tendency to just think of like a solution and then lock in on it. And people get really protective of the things like the solutions they've locked in on. When if you back it up to like what the problem is, or like I mentioned, that's a lot of times where the gap is the founder is thinking about like, well, we could do that and that would solve that problem, but it would cause these three other problems. But if those three other problems aren't something that the person you're trying to communicate this to ever has to think about, they're not going to those problems aren't going to occur to them. So helping them see the whole ecosystem of what you're thinking about, it can be hard to do, but if you do that and invest in training your team to see what you see, it can really, really help.
Very well said and beautifully articulated, Miss Jody. You describe yourself as someone who is exceptionally good at making things better. But at once they fix and systematize, I lose interest. How did its self awareness serve you as COO? And did you have built system to manage your own engagement while also building systems for the firm?
Yeah, I mean, the part that worked out for me was there was always right about the time I would get something working, there was always something new that needed to be worked on. It was I saw somewhere sometime that by the I don't know if they do this anymore, but by the time they finish painting the Golden Gate Bridge, they need to go back and and start and paint it again. It was a little bit like that. There was always something new. Um, but yeah, I will back up one step. I think one of the best things you can do, regardless of whether you're an entrepreneur or in any role, is to really know what your strengths are. And there's a nuance about weaknesses. There are some things I knew I had to get better at doing. And there are other things that I will never be good at doing. And those aren't things I should be doing. Like discerning what your highest and best use is and focusing on that and figuring out what else has to be in place so that you don't have to lean on those things that just aren't your best. Because there are other people who thrive on that work and getting everyone, the cliche of it is getting everyone in the right seats on the bus. Um, there's really no value in sitting in a seat on the bus that isn't yours. And if you're not supposed to be there, it's wildly important to figure out how to minimize that. So yeah, I'm really good at creating systems. And then I would either hire or delegate or find people in the firm who were the right people to keep that system going most of the time. I definitely do that in my own business now. And there you need a certain what's the word I want? Like shamelessness almost. Like it doesn't matter what the thing is. If it's very early in this business, I just noticed that scheduling is like brings out a really weird part of my brain. I like it feel I hired someone to do scheduling long before that made sense from a typical business structure because I won't bore you with all the details. It's just it was not the best use of my time and that freed me up to do what I am really good at doing. And I felt silly about it. So I for quite a while, so I didn't do it. And then I just realized like this is the block in me growing this company is something that I'm only resisting because I feel silly about it. But if I put myself in the position of thinking like not what I need, but what does the business need? And the business needs scheduling to happen smoothly and not the way my brain is trying to do it. And it needs me doing what I do best. And so kind of elevating the conversation to not what does this person need or that person need, but what does the company need? And trusting that like what the company needs is what needs to drive the decisions of who does what.
Very well said, Miss Jody. And tell us, get your essential recharge guide for entrepreneurs. What is all about?
Yeah, so this is loosely based on the seven kinds of rest. entrepreneurs are not great at resting a lot of times. Um,
Mm.
whether they are just wired that way. You take people who are wired that way, and then you add into it the hustle culture and this sort of newer version of it, the 996 model of how you work, which from a neuroscience standpoint is basically like flat Earth theory. Like that is not how the brain works. It's not what the brain needs. And so the reason I flipped it around from rest a little bit is that it's not always about rest, because people think of rest as I'm going to flop on the couch or take a hot bath or sleep more. Those things can be great, but you have to know what recharge, it's about recharging, not about resting. You have to keep that battery up. And the seven kinds of rest was an article I read, and it's so useful because I sometimes scan through the seven different kinds of rest, because sometimes I'm getting enough sleep, I'm getting enough rest, but what I need is like creative rest, or I need to be outside. Like sometimes what I need is to go for me personally, is like to go for a walk in the forest. I have one client who recharges by really heavy exercise, like almost every single day. Not everybody needs that, but he does. And so knowing and having more options uh, to think about, of like, what kind of recharge do I need? Sometimes people need to be away from people to recharge. Other people need to connect with people that fill them up to recharge. And so there's not just one answer, which is part of all of the work that I do. Like very little leadership advice or business advice is applicable to everyone. Very little. I can barely think of anything. You have to know yourself really well in order to be the best leader you need to be. And you have to pay attention to what you need and what your brain needs to optimize your cognition. And that requires whatever version of recharge works for you, whether it's a video game or time in the forest. It doesn't matter what it is. You have to know what it is, and then you have to invest in time in those things when you need it.
Yeah, indeed. So, Miss Jody, before we wrap up our discussion for today, I'm inviting you to please do listen to my other podcast, people. My other podcast, because my abstract essay is already in sixth season, abstract poetry in third season, and of course, my book 101 review in sixth season, two comedy 101 in fourth season, and my food 101 in sixth season as well. Geography 101 love letters, movie 101 review, music 101 are in fifth season, science 101, sex 101 fourth season, and my baby podcast, review 101, motivation 101, spiritual awakening 101, entrepreneurship 101, law 101, mental health 101, coaching 101, of course, my Bible verses 101. Please listen to them wherever you listen your podcast. So, Miss Jody, you've said your highest value is options, the concrete ability to choose. You build a career helping leaders make clearer decision, and you've lived through your own accidental unplanned journey from answering phones to COO as well as a founder. If you could whisper as one of the sentence into the ear of every leader listening right now who feels stuck in the forest, unsure what they where is out, what would want them to hear?
I would say that it should never be lonely at the top. There are very many reasons why it feels that way, but it the research on isolation for entrepreneurs is overwhelming, and you need to have people to talk to, whether that's someone like me or a peer group or friends. You have to have people you can talk to that get it, that understand your world, and there's no better thing you can do than find that for yourself.
Certainly, very well said, Miss Jody. So, can you please invite our listeners to support at the core or anything you want to promote on Entrepreneurship 101? Miss Jody,
Yes.
can you please invite our listeners to support your business or whatever you projects that you're
Oh,
doing right now?
sorry, I didn't hear the question. Yeah,
No worries.
actually, if you go to my site at thecore.com/gift, there are several things there that you can download, or and there's some discounted sessions and things like that. I'm adding and taking things away all the time. So there's always a bunch of stuff there.
Definitely, people, let's support Miss Jodi Hume, because if you support her, for sure, many more at the core will, well, rise. So, Miss Jodi, thank you so much for your time.
Thank you.
Bodycam people, see you soon.